You touched on something that I kind of wanted to bring up. In the first term, President Trump promised to drain the swamp. That was kind of his thing. And the swamp ate him up. There's no doubt about that. And there are a lot of factors there. And quite frankly, a lot of the factors of how different this term is versus the first term are at play here. But I'm finding that the swamp is a tough place. It really, really is.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today I am speaking with Tom Pyle, who is the president of both the Institute for Energy Research and the American Energy Alliance. I have him expound upon what those organizations do during the discussion. But the connection I have is from, I had to go check my resume to remind myself of the dates, from 2007 through 2020 with a brief stretch in there that I took a break for personal reasons. I was the Senior Economist for the Institute for Energy Research. And specifically, I was focused on the carbon tax debate, or more broadly, the economics of climate change. And so Tom and I do allude to that in the discussion. Tom, just more generally, let me just share with you folks, he really, in terms of like me trying to understand what's going on in Washington and just asking somebody, hey, what's the situation in terms of not being naive, but also not going hook, line, and sinker for the latest conspiracy theory, I guess, for lack of a better term. I really like Tom's judgment on these matters. Besides the lengthy career he's had at this point running the Institute for Energy Research, Tom has a lot of prior consulting experience. And then also, reading from his official bio here, Tom has held numerous positions on Capitol Hill, including serving as a policy analyst for the Majority Whip of the U.S. House and as staff director for the Congressional Western Caucus. And precisely because Tom has so much experience working on Capitol Hill and knows all the players involved and has seen this stuff over the decades, at times in this discussion, folks, you'll hear I'll stop him and say, wait a minute, just spell that out. Like how does that work? And so you're going to get a civics education as well as learning about energy policy. Last thing I'll say is, what's the relevance of this if you're a standard InFi podcast listener? We touch on not just Trump's tariffs, but also U.S. energy policy more broadly. And these things definitely have an impact on not just the U.S. market, but the global economy. And so I think this is all going to be very relevant regardless of your particular interests. So without further ado, here is my discussion with Tom Pyle. Tom, welcome to the InFi podcast.
Such a great pleasure to be here, Bob. Good to see you again.
Nice seeing you. So I would have told people, who you are in the pre-recorded introduction, but maybe just to give a little infomercial, what is the Institute for Energy Research, the American Energy Alliance?
Yeah, sure. We're a DC-based think tank, the Institute. We look at energy policy and figure out how it impacts people, primarily, also business, also the economy, and also how energy policy here in the United States impacts the world affairs, world events, things like that. The advocacy arm is called the American Energy Alliance, and that's where we punch pretty hard, as you know. Our philosophy is that when left to its devices, the free market works significantly better than government-issued edicts. And certainly we think that the federal government shouldn't be anywhere near involved in the energy business as it is. So that's it, us in a nutshell.
Okay, great. And I had mentioned you, Tom, while we were chatting before. I think maybe the best way to start this discussion is I just want to make sure Americans are aware, and foreigners too, for those tuning in, just the amazing turnaround in terms of long-term, U.S. oil production. So, folks, we're flashing up here if you're watching the video. This is showing, this is from the EIA, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, U.S. field production of crude oil. And you can see it peaked in literally 1970. And then it's just started a gentle decline, just kept going down and down and down. And that was consistent. I think, Tom, you and I are similar ages. When, we were growing up, it was just taught that, the world's run out of oil, and the U.S. in particular, and that's why we got to tighten our belts and we got to switch over and get into electric vehicles and stuff because we're running out of oil and we don't want to be defended. And then all of a sudden, there's this chart showing for some reason it bottomed out in like 2007 and just went through the roof and just kept rising, breaking records. And then a similar chart now showing this one. This is net imports it's a combined category, folks. It's crude oil and petroleum products. And so again, a net import means we're importing more than we're exporting. And you can see the net imports were, rising throughout all the 80s and 90s and early to mid 2000s. And then it peaks around 2005. and then starts declining. And then it actually goes negative in 2020, and then now is continuing to drop, meaning we're net exporters. Okay, so it went from this, scarcity mindset, and we're running out of oil, and we got to switch over to something else. And like, duh, of course, there's only so much oil, and that doesn't seem to have been happening. And Tom, I don't think Americans are aware of that. It was kind of like when the Soviet Union fell, nobody really cared. They just kept going on like it was a Thursday or something. So do you want to talk about any of this?
Yeah, Bob, it's really difficult to sort of see the magnitude of this if you're not thinking about it on a regular basis. Since the shale revolution, which by that I mean since the beginning of the use of a technology called hydraulic fracturing combined with horizontal drilling, which basically means that we dig down and then we dig across these seams of what are called shale. So it's just basically oil and sand all along these mile-long seams. And we're able to pull this oil out, which we never were able to do so before. And since, with the numbers that you showed and the charts that you showed, since that time, the United States has produced 80% of the world's incremental barrels of oil, meaning of all the new barrels of oil since that 2007-8 time frame, 80% of it has come from the United States. We were growing up, anytime there was a skirmish in the Middle East, anytime that there was something happens in Libya or whatever, the markets went absolutely nuts. You see what's going on now. We have a land war in Asia. We have Middle East, a massive war in the Middle East, and the price of oil hasn't been impacted in nearly any way, shape, or form by these events, which is absolutely unheard of or would have been unheard of before then. So that's one thing. The other thing is that it has enabled us to export a whole lot of oil and gas, natural gas, which has changed sort of what they call it soft power. Like we exert more influence around the world because we're not looking for oil from other countries, the Middle East, Iran, and Venezuela, and other places. And so a lot of that has really upended sort of geopolitics. But at home, we've had sustained bottom of the barrel natural gas prices. And that has had a tremendous impact on residential prices, the ability for us to enhance and increase and bring in manufacturing in this country, more jobs. And the fact that we're producing all of this crude oil is just tremendous benefits across the board for everybody, businesses, consumers, the economy, everything.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, so thanks for that. The people, fracking was a big thing, but then, as I was studying and people were emphasizing that, really understood that it's not just the hydraulic fracturing, it's also the horizontal drilling. It's those two things put together that really caused that explosion.
Well, there's one other element too, which is interesting because we have shale. There's shale plays all over the world. Israel, Eastern Europe, a lot of places have shale. What they don't have is the unique system of property rights that we have in this country. Because land, we own the property, but we also own the subsurface. And a lot of other places, like in the UK, Canada, Eastern Europe, obviously, landowners don't own the subsurface. The crown or the state owns the subsurface. And so what that means is, who in the hell would want someone to put a rig or a well in their backyard if they're not going to reap the benefits of that? And the result of that for these landowners in Pennsylvania, in Texas, in North Dakota, in Arkansas, for example, whole towns have gotten unbelievably wealthy as a result of that. People became instant millionaires over the course of since the beginning of this second wave of boom production in the United States. So that's sort of the third factor that is really important when it comes to how we were able to do it.
Okay, great. And then related to that I know very well from my time at IER was you guys have what you call the North American Energy Inventory. I think your latest version was put out in 2024. Can you tell people what that is?
Sure. It's basically, to the best of our ability, using government sources, EIA, USGS, stuff like that, what we have underneath our lands and waters, both in the United States, Canada, and to some extent Mexico. But their politics are so screwy there that it's hard to get good data out of Mexico. But the bottom line of that is we're the richest energy nation in the world, bar none. We have more, and President Trump says it all the time, calls it liquid gold. But we have more oil, gas, coal methane hydrates, which is, still not technologically feasible or economically feasible. But we've got more hydrocarbon resources under our lands and waters than anybody else in the world. That includes Russia, Saudi Arabia, you name it. And when you combine it with Canada, we blow the world away in terms of our God-given resources.
Yeah. And again, well, have folks go check it out. But I mean, it's not like, oh, hey, at current rates of consumption, we've got 32 weeks left of this stuff. I mean, it is just as far as the eye can see. Like humans won't need to use carbon-based energy by the time that would run out.
Yeah, my take on it is that you talked about the sort of the running out in our childhood and our younger adult years. The peak oil crowd, they're just been wrong. They're just wrong because in the history of us revising our inventory, it's never been revised downward. We've always found more oil. We've always found more natural gas, not just here, but all over the world. You see stories about this find and that find, and now Guyana is potentially going to get into the game. And so theoretically, we won't need to switch off of these resources unless we choose to. And that I'll stick to that theory. I'm an unlimited oil theory guy. I don't think we're ever going to run out of these resources.
Yeah. Okay. Well, how do you want to tackle this? I suppose people could say, hey, I guess we passed the 100-day mark, right? But what's your assessment of Trump 2.0?
Trump 2.0 was tan, rested, and ready. That's kind of how I'd prescribe. Literally tan, like, right, orange man. But like, I was extremely impressed with the breadth and the speed at which he went about implementing his agenda, especially on energy issues. The first day, I think, were like 25 or so, or the first few days, 25 or so executive orders, essentially wiping out the 4 years of the Biden administration's mischief. We've actually, during the Biden years, we cataloged over 250 specific actions that the Biden administration took to make it harder to produce oil and gas in our country. We've now done a list of things that Trump has done to undo that or make it easier to produce energy in this country. He's already up to like 75 in the first 100 days or so. That's impressive. But this is not, EOs are just as good as the ink that they're written on. And that's kind of part of the challenge here. The next wave, if you will, I kind of view this in three parts. The next wave is to nullify and or revise regulations. And, he's already made it clear that he has directed all of his agencies to go through with a fine-tooth comb all of the regulations on the books and figure out a way to undo them or revise them in a way that are much more manageable. Not designed in a way to make it impossible to produce these resources, but in a way that makes it likely to produce these resources. But that takes a lot of time. They have this pesky thing called the Administrative Procedures Act. There were some rules in the first Trump administration, they didn't even finish. And in some instances, they were just thrown out in the courts, right? Because the folks who don't want to see this happen are obviously going to be filing a lot of lawsuits. The third tranche, if you will, is what's happening right now on Capitol Hill with the big, beautiful bill, this reconciliation. This is where...
Hey, Tom, can I stop you? These terms get thrown around. I know you have a long history around DC politics. What does reconciliation mean? What does that term mean?
It's a cheap end run around the filibuster, basically, in the Senate. So when the House and Senate pass a budget, then they instruct their committees to find what, the budget's a blueprint. And then they instruct their committees to go and put policy in place that will make the budget a reality. And so all the committees who have issues within the budget, which is almost all of them, some larger than others, obviously the tax writing committees have a huge component, have to go and effectuate the vision of the budget. And then there's this process called reconciliation where you can bring this legislation to the floor and, quote, reconcile the differences between policy that exists today or fiscal policy that exists today and the changes that want to be made. Mm-hmm. And it used to be a technical sort of procedural thing. And so therefore, it only required 51 votes in the Senate. But as you and I know, Bob, having done this for a long time, the Senate has been incapable of legislating for the better part of a decade and a half. And so what has happened is both parties have abused this technical sort of reconciliation loophole to get around the filibuster. That's really what ends up happening. And so, unfortunately, as we
Can
saw,
you spell that? I understand the words you just said, but I don't. How does that work? Like, why the filibuster would stop what, but now they're doing exactly what so that they can't use
yeah,
the
sure. So it takes 60 votes to pass any legislation in the Senate. Because if somebody filibusters, technically it's 51, but if somebody filibusters a piece of legislation, then the threshold increases to 60 votes.
Okay, to get that guy to shut up and just move on.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so what happened is, a perfect example is with judges. Forever and ever and ever, judges were subject to the filibuster. And then Harry Reid decided he didn't like that anymore. And he basically said, forget it. The filibuster doesn't apply to judges. Right. So now we can pass judges with 51 votes. Reconciliation is the only major legislative type policy that can fall under the 51 vote threshold. So that's kind of what it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we took a little detour there just to give some civics education to the masses here. But so go back to I interrupted you. So that's what they're doing right now with the.
Right. And the reason I say that's a third and important component is because you've heard of the IRA, right? The Biden Inflation Reduction Act.
I thought you were talking about the Irish Republican Army.
Well, it's not that different. it's a train wreck. But the IRA basically subsidized to the tune of now somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.2 to $2 trillion worth of giveaways to predominantly renewables, wind and solar, electric vehicles, batteries, this thing called carbon capture and sequestration, which is a pipe dream, hydrogen, geothermal. Basically, the government picking winners and losers through the through tax policy. It's a huge drain on the taxpayers. Also, billions of dollars in giveaways to green organizations, by the way, which was in the IRA. If President Trump is to be successful after his second term and maybe his last term, he needs to get rid of as many of these subsidies as humanly possible. Unfortunately, where the Congress is headed right now, as the Wall Street Journal put it, it's a solid single. A lot of the subsidies aren't going to be eliminated. They're going to be, quote, phased out. And you and I know what that means. Nothing actually dies in Congress, especially these subsidies for these corporations and things like that. So if you combine Trump's EOs, you combine Trump's regulations that he has to upend, and if we're able to somehow pull a rabbit out of our hat and do a better job eliminating these subsidies, we're golden. We're in a much different place than we have been when you and I were fighting these wars together, because it's going to be a lot harder for them to undo a lot of that stuff. And so I'm optimistic, I'm realistic, and I'm optimistic. But if Trump does nothing else in these issues, we're still way further along than we would have been if, we had Kamala Harris sitting in the White House. So,
I mean, can you speak to what I don't understand? And I know a guy, I don't know Trump's inner circle, but I know the people that do know them. And I've been sending them things like, hey, you guys, you need money, you want to do tax cut. Why don't you there's like hundreds of billions, easy, arguably trillions of stuff that they could auction off either the rights to or sell the land outright for energy development on federal land. Is that in the cards?
Yes and no. The problem with that, I've been on this kick. As you know, I've been in DC for 30 years in various capacities. Ironically, the folks who complain the most about federal land ownership, mainly the folks out west, and your audience might not know this as well as the stuff you talked about in the beginning, federal government owns 2/3 of the land mass. They're the hugest landlord in the United States. They own unbelievable amounts of land. And if you include properties in big cities like Miami and LA and Chicago and everything else, you're right. They could unload a lot of this and save tons and tons of money, and also do some development in areas, not parks, not wilderness areas, none of that, but in areas where they were designated for multiple use. The challenge is that as much as they complain about it, the Westerners kind of like federal land ownership. There's a congressman named Ryan Zinke, used to be the Interior Secretary under Trump 1, who said that a red line in the reconciliation bill for him is the selling of 1 acre of federal lands. And he's from Montana. So you touched on something that I kind of wanted to bring up. In the first term, President Trump promised to drain the swamp. That was kind of his thing. And the swamp ate him up. There's no doubt about that. And there are a lot of factors there. And quite frankly, a lot of the factors of how different this term is versus the first term are at play here. But I'm finding that the swamp is a tough place. It really, really is. As much as President Trump, and I know folks who are, sitting outside the Oval Office and have conversations with some of these folks, they are deadly serious about disruption in Washington, D.C. They don't feel like the agencies are going far enough. You see what's going on, not just in our space, but across the board. And realistically, unfortunately, there's so much inertia towards the status quo in Washington that it takes this type of effort to even get a modest amount of change. Things sort of fall back to their mean, right? That's kind of what's going on with this reconciliation bill. That's what's happening with Doge, unfortunately. Originally it was 2 trillion, and then it was $1 trillion, and now we're looking at a couple $100 billion, right? And that's just unfortunately the nature of the beast. And unless and until we get a couple more Trumps sequentially, I'm afraid that's just there's just so much entrenched interest in the status quo in Washington that you can see if you follow this stuff, it's really hard to get change done.
Yeah. And on that point, take this how you want, but after living through this, I understand now other countries. And when you see there was a military junta and then this happened and this guy's in jail and everyone knew he was corrupt, but the people don't care because the people he was stealing from were corrupt them. You know what I mean? I understand now, world history a lot better. I get why everyone thought that was a better thing than what they had. Anyway, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I feel much wiser now after seeing what's been going on. And like you said, the stuff, with the FBI, his own FBI trying to sabotage him and this isn't a conspiracy. This is all out in the open. You can go read about this, various reports and things. They didn't do anything about it, but this is all out in the open about what happened the first time around, whether the listeners think it was a good thing or a bad thing. It is kind of amazing that this new president comes in and just all of the forces that are aligned against him. So, yeah, I guess maybe just one of the things you mentioned there, just to focus in. So Doge, can you just elaborate on that? Because, that was just another example where, right, they came out guns blazing. It seemed that there was a lot. Do you know, I don't know, did Elon kind of bite off too much and the public just turned on him a little bit? I don't know. It seemed like maybe the public, his popularity waned or something. Or am I misreading that?
No, I think Elon did exactly what he needed to do. He needed to sort of deflect some of the ire away from President Trump, right? I mean, he knew that he was going to suffer a dip in popularity, but guess what? Someone who is the richest man in the world might not care too much about his public opinion. It'll change. You remember he was the darling of the left, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So I think
that's what's so funny. It's how all these people clarifying when I bought my vehicle, I didn't realize what a fascist he, you know what I mean? He used to be the guy, it's going to take
electric vehicles are, supposed to save the world. And now no one wants to buy them because Elon Musk makes them, right? It just shows you how political this whole debate is on climate change. But I think they were successful in maybe more ways than saving money. They exposed a lot of the corruption. They exposed a lot of the self-dealing. They exposed a lot of the sort of ideology in some of these agencies and tried to purge some of it. USAID comes to mind when I think about that. And I do think, if they upgrade and update our technology systems in the government, that's going to save us money. But you know what? What it does, I think, is condition the landscape for a real sustained effort to try and cut government waste, cut government spending. It takes a few cycles to sort of get cemented in people's heads that, maybe it is a good thing that we, Bill Clinton talked about waste, fraud, and abuse. Barack Obama, George Bush, they all talked about waste, fraud, and abuse. But to his credit, this president is the first and only one in my lifetime that's actually attempted and is attempting to do something about it.
Well, yeah, and to point to tangible things, even in the first term, when people were asking me, what do you think about him? And I was saying, so I'm curious your take too. So back then, I thought, compared to Trump's rhetoric, as always happens, they say a bunch of stuff and then they get in there and they realize, but like pulling us out of the Paris Agreement, that I couldn't believe he did that. I mean, can you imagine George W. Bush doing that?
Hell no way.
Ethanol mandate, George? No. So it's, so I was saying that, and then also too, we won't name names, but like some of the appointees in the first one, I was like, I've worked with those guys. They're pretty radical. Like they're pretty libertarian. Like, you wouldn't know if you don't know the guy, but that's amazing that they're actually influencing federal policy as opposed to being at some, libertarian think tank or some tenured college professor cranking out white papers that isn't going to do anything. So anyway, I would always say on energy issues, he was remarkably radical even in that first term. And now this time around, it seemed like it was much broader.
Yeah, huge. The amount of upending he's attempting to do on this climate agenda is breathtaking. And it's weird because sometimes I got to pinch myself, right? Because you and I, when we battled together, I always feel like the Viet Cong, right? Like just try and hold the line and annoy the other side and make them like work even harder, but eventually they're going to win. But we're winning. We are absolutely winning. The net zero agenda across the country and around the world, quite frankly, is waning a lot. The renewables guys aren't even talking about climate anymore. They're remarketing themselves as part of the energy dominance solution.
Yeah, right.
If you look at the tech guys, for example, AI, I think, is what kills climate change, quite frankly. Because if you think about it, two of the sort of powerful interest groups that were working against us were the banks, the Larry Finks of the world, the New York houses, and the tech guys. The tech guys were all talking about net zero. And when we lived in a world where demand for electricity was flat and renewables were basically like a very tiny part of the electricity mix, there was a lot of room for mischief. But now, in certain parts of the country, like California and Texas, for example, renewables have penetrated the sort of electricity mix to the point now where they're being disruptive. They're not building data centers in California for a reason. The power isn't reliable enough. And these guys are now cutting deals, doing deals with utilities to produce huge amounts of new natural gas-fired electricity generation. And they're still struggling with how to message that because they've been so like green for so many years that they now have to sort of pivot and sort of contribute to the conversation in a way that includes building new gas power plants, new pipelines, and nuclear is sort of the thing everyone keeps pointing to, but that's not going to happen for years. There's too much regulatory.
Okay, that I had definitely observed. I was going to even just ask you that literally the next battery of questions was about the climate change debate because that seems like that just disappeared. But okay, so that is interesting. So I guess another way of putting it is some people are like, you know what? You can mine more Bitcoins or you can reduce carbon emissions. And they're like, I want my Bitcoins. So
that song, Video Killed the Radio Star?
Yeah.
AI killed the climate agenda. Like that's kind of what's happening. Look at Larry Fink.
Yeah.
Look at the reversal of all these guys who are leading on ESG. Look at what they're saying now, right? So, and they're investing money in hydrocarbon production. And so it's great. It's kind of weird for me because during those dark days, we were kind of a pariah, right? We didn't jump on the bandwagon and say, oh, well, we got to be part of the solution. No, we said, look, this is killing people. This agenda hurts people. It makes electricity and energy more expensive. It means that the people who are on the lower economic scale, rings of the ladder spend more of their income on just basic filling their tank and paying their utility bills. And nobody seemed to care about that except for us and maybe a couple other stragglers.
Well, the other thing too that was, and forgive me, Tom, this is my favorite talking point from my whole career with you guys, was that it was the same weekend that William Nordhaus wins the Nobel Prize in the economics version of it for his work on climate change. And then the UN releases its IPCC special report on limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And Nordhaus is, giving interviews to the New York Times and stuff. And they're asking, hey, is it do we still have time to limit warming to 1.5 C? He's like, oh, no, I think unfortunately, that horse has left the barn, blah, blah, blah. His own work showed that would be such a draconian, stupid policy. It would be better if the governments did nothing rather than try to limit warming to 1.5 C. And yet he didn't volunteer that in the interview. And thank goodness, you know what I mean? And it was just amazing, the chasm between, and also the last thing too, I'll say on this is that in the beginning, when I, first joined with you guys and was really getting into this, the thing was follow the science, follow this, and people would point to the peer reviewed, blah, blah. And then when, I started pointing out that I think it was a combination of we learned more, but also the activists just kept pushing the envelope. And at some point, even the interventionist economist guys like William Nordhaus or whatever, their models could only justify a modest carbon tax. There was no way you could possibly justify that this makes sense. And so at that point, the activists said, oh yeah, guys like William, you can't trust these economists. Their models are crazy. They threw them under the bus. So I don't know if you want to react. Yeah.
As soon as, two things. One, I will say your work was instrumental in preventing the United States from imposing carbon taxes. I'll just say that flat out.
Wow.
But also, it's not about climate change. It's a dogmatic political, sort of strategy to, pad the Democratic Party. Environmental groups have moved so far away from what their intentions were when the movement sprung up, when we had Silent Spring and we had, the Cuyahoga, whatever, the Lake Niagara Falls. We had all these point source problems in this country, and they were very real and they were very harmful. And the United States has done more. Your point about if we did nothing, we might as well do nothing. Even if the government does nothing, we get better outcomes anyway.
Right.
If you look at all the criteria pollutants, the stuff that really makes you sick, the NOx and SOx and things like that, we have more people, more cars, more GDP over the last 25, 30 years. And yet we have trace amounts of these toxic, things in our air at the exact same time. We've had all of this economic development. Wealth is health. And that's why we're so strident about sort of taking a free market approach to these issues, because we get the efficiency gains, we get the resource, and we get better environments. Because if you have wealth, you can distribute that wealth in a way that goes beyond just meeting people's basic needs.
Yeah, it's another illustration of that. When people worry about nuclear reactors, oh, Chernobyl, it's well, that wasn't a free market paradise where that happened, right? So there's a reason, and it's the Soviet Union did not have very pristine rivers and so forth that they hit. No, we got to push industrial production, and who cares if you get some sludge in your river. Can I circle back though, Tom? The earlier stuff, because that was intriguing about why the tech bros all of a sudden flipped. But is there another thing too, where it's partly just they can see where things are going? For example, Zuckerberg. Now all of a sudden he's, oh man, it was so unfair what happened in the Biden administration, and they made me regulate speech, and that was the last thing I wanted to do. And let me tell you, the insides, how much of it is just they're looking around and, oh wait, people, there's the villagers are getting angry. Let me all of a sudden explain. Oh no, I'm with you guys.
I think there's some of that, Bob, but I think that when you're talking about a policy goal like winning the AI race, and you can argue that that's of genuine import. We don't want China to be controlling all of this stuff. I don't even know what the end result of all this AI stuff is going to be. I'm an old guy, so I'm tinkering around with it, but my staff, my younger folks are doing a lot more with it. I don't know what it's going to end up being, but we all know it's important, and it's sort of the future in terms of the technology and information and things like that. And it takes, even just data centers alone, right? It just takes an incredible amount of power, and it has to be reliable. And they have to have long-term contracts for this power. And so I think, in part, it's positioning, right? Everyone wants to look at what's going on in the Middle East right now, right? President Trump is practically a deity. But I think in part, it is their opportunity to reposition themselves to be much more realistic and to abandon some of this climate stuff that they sort of got themselves hooked into. And so I'm optimistic because they got a lot more resources than we do, and they work the system pretty effectively. And, I know from firsthand that they are literally at the moment doing focus groups and testing messages trying to extricate themselves from the sort of the hard green, net zero, and we got only 100% renewable.
Oh, I
It's
see.
just not
Yeah.
it's just not real, and they
So,
know it.
so you're just to make sure I understand. You're saying these major players who had spent a lot of money and messaging to, hey, we love green, we're renewable, all this sort of thing. Climate change is the most important threat facing humanity. That now they're trying to figure out doing test groups like how do we kind of pivot away from that so there's not cognitive dissonance among our advertisers and customers and blah blah blah, that if all of a sudden we're not talking about that anymore. Is that what you're saying?
100%. I know from firsthand experience. So
Okay, well that's really interesting. If you don't mind, Tom, just a few minutes here, I got you remaining, because again, you're one of the guys that I know personally that you have a lot of experience, and I like your judgment and everything. Can you just comment? Like, I'm still astonished at the Democratic Party, that what happened last year and how they pushed Biden for so long until that debate when it was just, yeah, we can't keep going on with this farce and swapping in, like, is that, were there insiders with the Democratic Party that were like earlier saying, what are you guys doing? This is insane. Or do you have any insight into that?
yeah, I mean, there's a couple of factors. The first is when you're in power, it's hard to give up power, right? And so the Biden crime family, the Biden, Biden Inc., all of his handlers, the Ron Klain.
That's a scientific term, right? Biden
Yeah,
crime.
of course.
That's the AEA version of this interview.
Yeah, the AEA version. But they're sitting, they're in a bunker. A lot of people are sort of pecking at them, and they're insulated to some extent, and they think they can give it another run, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is, we were talking about Biden's cognitive decline right out of the gate.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It wasn't all of a sudden. And, all this, the media, what they're, deep, they're, what they call them, like something fakes.
No, the deep fakes
or deep fakes, or people can see with their eyes. People aren't stupid, right? It's like, oh, and President Biden, sorry to be respectful there, he's been pretty awful his whole entire political career. Like,
it was like earlier, he was just a liar, but then he became a liar with dementia.
But, you got to think about this. The Democratic Party rigged the last two primaries. There wasn't a primary for Hillary Clinton. You remember Donna Brazile was feeding her questions from the debates, and the whole system was in the primary was built around getting her the nomination. Then they did the same thing to get Biden nominated as well. And then now you had this switcheroo with Kamala Harris when they were like, man, the numbers. I mean, Trump's numbers were like 8, 10, 12% leads in all the battleground states. But when the debate happened, we were done. Like, that election was over. There was nothing President Trump could do. And believe me, he tried to blow his lead in that general election. And so they pulled a Hail Mary. And I don't know what happened. There was all kinds of talk about, maybe having a truncated primary, whatnot. Rumor is that Biden said, you know what, fine. You want me out? Then I'm going to go out and endorse Kamala, and let's watch you try to undo that. Right?
Oh, that's interesting.
There could have been some of that going on as well. But look, they're in complete disarray, and it's fantastic. And they deserve to be in disarray because the only thing they've run on for the past 2 or 3 terms is, we're not Trump. They don't have an agenda. They don't have anything to offer the American people. And, Trump, like him or hate him, he's got an agenda, and he's running it. And both in the first term and in this term, he wants to keep his promises. And I think that's refreshing for a politician.
Yeah. And also, I think their strategic error too was not merely it wasn't that they were merely saying, again, we're brushing with broad strokes here, folks, but it wasn't merely like, oh, Trump is awful and is the next Hitler, or, whatever, white supremacist, whatever terms are, but also, and the people who like him are likewise just irredeemably evil. It was like, those are the people you want to vote for you next time. What are you doing?
Yeah, exactly.
Like I said, I'm no expert, I'm just a layman. But anyway, it just seemed to me that's not the way to win another election, is to just, excoriate the people that you're trying to court their vote.
Yeah, exactly. So.
As opposed to, you think he's going to bring your jobs back, you blue collar workers, but the Democrats we're the union, we're the ones that are going to, like, as opposed to something like that, where you're trying to convince them that why are you trusting this guy?
Hillary called us deplorables.
Mhm.
Remember? So
I guess, what are your thoughts? Last open-ended question I'll give you here, Tom. Are you optimistic for the future? I know you kind of laid out like what needs to happen while he's still in there. Like, do you think they are going to get in place a lot of stuff, particularly, pertaining to your issues of energy policy?
Yeah, I'm very bullish. I'm shocked at, how easy it is to we're like the cool kids now.
Yeah.
A little bit weird, Plenty of folks in the administration got recommendations from IR. We're a good brand with this administration. And the Congress is going to do what the best they can. The margins are narrow. The Senate looks good in the midterms. There's been a lot of retirements in the Democratic Party. Honestly, we need another term. I joked earlier about Trump's third term, but we do need another term. Otherwise, we're going to go back to this whipsaw, right? Like, this is what we've experienced over the last 3 or 4 general election cycles, is this massive sort of swing especially in energy policy, but generally across the board. But long term, and I always close with this with everybody, we need a Congress that functions again, because Congress is theoretically, of the equals, the more important body, the one that's closest to the people, the one that legislates. They've been dysfunctional now for at least 15 or 20 years. Nothing of consequence goes through Congress anymore. There are no big bipartisan bills that are meaningful and make a difference. And unless and until, and I think maybe the courts will help, especially on regulatory stuff, but unless and until Congress reasserts itself in this constitutional process, I think that we're going to see presidents exert more and more power and control in the executive, which isn't what our founders intended. And why you have these momentous battles over Supreme Court nominees and presidents is because the power has shifted to those 10 people. And that's really not how this country was set up. So, we got to fix that institution before we can see, before we can get past this wide swing in policy from one administration to another, right? That's kind of my take on it. But I am optimistic in part because of what I talked about before. I think more and more people recognize that the climate agenda was just a bridge too far from reality. And I think people are starting to sort of move back to the center on these issues.
Okay, well, yeah. So thanks for that. I agree with your analysis, and I suppose it'll all get fixed when GPT-9 just takes over our government for us. And
yeah. I will say this: the best use of these things so far for me has been taking these huge pieces of legislation and dumping it in and saying, "Summarize this for me."
Yeah,
because these guys pass these 2,000-page bills and then vote on them 2 days later, and the public has no idea what's going on. But now we can get what's in it faster, and we can talk about the crap that's in it faster and put these guys on their heels a little bit. So I think that's been sort of, for me, the best use of AI and the chat GPTs of the world so far.
Yeah, definitely a good implication. Well, Tom, thanks so much for your time and your insights here, folks. My guest has been Tom Pyle, the president of the Institute for Energy Research and the American Energy Alliance. Tom, keep up the good fight.
Thanks, man. Good to see you.
Nice seeing you. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.